Good evening. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. Before I hand over to the chair for tonight, Jenni Russell, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. Over to Jenni.
Thank you very much, Millicent. Good evening. Wow, it's a really packed room. Somebody said to me, Sex and the Citadel, isn't that just a jazzy title designed to seduce people into buying a book? And I said, yes, but it's worth it when you get there. And I don't know how many of you have actually read the book, but it's completely gripping and revelatory and written in a very accessible style. And I can assure you I don't feel this enthusiastic about a lot of the books that I get sent for review. So I'm very pleased to have Shereen El Feki sitting opposite me today. Shereen is somebody who started off her working life as an immunologist and became intrigued by what was going on in the Arab world in terms of sexuality because she didn't believe the statistics that were turning up in front of her nose. And because she grew up in Canada with a very devout Egyptian father and a Welsh mother. Is it? Oh, is the microphone not working? Well, they can't hear me at the back. Let's just pause. That must be terribly frustrating. Hang on. Shall I just keep talking and you can tell me whether they can hear me yet? Is that improved? No? Yes? A bit? Sorry about this. Well, I could shout, but you might find it, yeah, exactly, the person at the front would really hate that. It's on maximum. I'm sorry, is this in the wrong place?
That's better. That's better.
Okay, well, so, okay, I'll just have to hold this at an angle, I think. Sorry about that. I was saying that Shereen grew up in Canada with a devout Egyptian father, a Muslim, and a Welsh mother. So she's got a double perspective on the Arab world, both as a half insider and a half outsider. And having begun her life as a scientist, she then moved into being a journalist for The Economist and for Al Jazeera, and now spends a lot of her time doing advocacy work on HIV. So the first thing I'd like to ask Shereen, because this is what intrigued me, before you start your reading from the book, is why you wanted to address this subject at all?
Again, it's, as you say, it's from my personal and my professional background. So as someone who is half Egyptian, Muslim, most of my family live in Egypt, I was connected to the Arab region, but not deeply because of growing up in Canada, and I really had a veneer of Arab culture and Islam on what was otherwise a very Western lifestyle. And it was really after September 11th that things changed for me. And I was reading so much about those Arabs and those Muslims that I realized I didn't have to just sit and listen to other people tell me about this part of the world, that I could go and find out for myself, that I had a privileged access in that sense. That I chose sex as my lens is, I know, a rather unusual perspective, and depending on where you stand on this, spending 5 years traveling across the Arab region talking to people about their sex lives is either going to be a dream job or a highly dubious occupation. For me, though, because of the background in HIV and wanting to understand what is going on, I was being told there is no HIV, and yet I was meeting men, women, and children, whole families that were infected. And it became very clear to me that sex was the stumbling block, and that the taboos around sex were a huge obstacle to dealing with what is really an emerging epidemic in the Arab region. And so that's how I came to the subject from a personal and professional standpoint.
Shereen, I wanted you to start just by reading a short passage from the book, because I think that gives people a flavour of what you're writing about.
I've actually put my book aside.
Oh,
so perhaps
that
we
was
have,
short-sighted.
well, we have quite a few here. Yes. You know, you write the book, you publish it, and then you move on. Thank you very much. What is it? 6 pairs of dark eyes stared at me, or rather, at the small purple rod in my hand. It's a vibrator, I answered, in English, racking my brain for the right Arabic word. A thing that makes fast movements came to mind, but as that could equally well apply to a hand mixer, I decided to stick with my mother tongue to minimize what I could sense was rising confusion in the room. One of the women, curled up on a divan beside me, began to unpin her hijab, a cascade of black hair falling down her back as she carefully put her headscarf to one side. "What does it do?" she asked. "Well, it vibrates," I added, taking a sip of mint tea and biting into a piece of syrupy baklava to buy myself some time before the inevitable rejoinder. But why? How I came to be demonstrating sex toys to a coffee morning of Cairo housewives is a long story. I have spent the past 5 years traveling across the Arab region asking people about sex, what they do, what they don't, what they think, and why. Depending on your perspective, this might sound like a dream job or a highly dubious occupation. For me, it is something else altogether. Sex is the lens through which I investigate the past and present of a part of the world about which so much is written and still so little is understood. Now, I grant you, sex might seem an odd choice given the spectacle of popular revolt playing out across the Arab world since the beginning of this decade, which has taken with it some of the region's most entrenched regimes, in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen for starters, and is shaking up the rest. Some observers, however, have gone so far as to argue that it was youthful sexual energy that fueled these protests in the first place. I'm not so sure. While I've often heard Egyptians say their fellow countrymen spend 99.9% of their time thinking about sex, in the heady days of early 2011, making love appeared for once to be the last thing on people's minds. But I don't believe it was entirely out of sight. Sexual attitudes and behaviors are intimately bound up in religion, tradition, culture, politics, and economics. They are part and parcel of sexuality, that is, the act and all that goes with it, including gender roles and identity, sexual orientation, pleasure, intimacy, eroticism, and reproduction. As such, sexuality is a mirror of the conditions that led to these uprisings, and it will be a measure of the progress of hard-won reforms in the years to come. If you really want to know a people, start by looking inside their bedrooms.
Thank you, Shereen. How did you get people to talk to you?
Given all the taboos that exist around sex in the Arab world, you would expect it to be incredibly difficult. The reality, however, is that it was extraordinarily easy. Or I'll keep doing the talking.
You just keep talking.
It was extraordinarily easy to get people to talk. And in fact, my problem was not getting people to talk about sex, it was getting them to stop talking about sex. And this was particularly true for women who really have very few opportunities to articulate their sexual fantasies and fears and desires and questions, really. They have lots and lots of questions. And really what worked to my advantage was, as you said, the insider-outsider status. So as someone who has a connection to the region, women in particular felt comfortable talking to me because they thought I would know where they were coming from. But again, you look at me and you see someone who looks Western. And that was actually an advantage as well, because people in the Arab world, many, have ideas about sexual life in the West, and that it's a free-for-all and anything goes, and that there is no judgment and no censure. And that worked to my advantage because, again, in sitting down with women, they often felt more comfortable because they thought they weren't going to be judged. It could have been the worst of both worlds, but it actually turned out to be the best, and the information and the questions kept on coming, and still continue to this day.
You're still in correspondence with them?
Oh, absolutely. Because of my work on HIV, I'm in communication with the groups and the individuals. Many of them have become personal friends and colleagues. And that was one of the more gratifying aspects of the book, because this wasn't just about an academic interest. This was about me also reconnecting with the region. And so the friendships I have formed and the collaborations, both in my personal and professional life, have really been one of the most rewarding aspects of doing this book.
One of the things that you make clear is that there always was a fantastic Arab tradition of writing joyfully about sex, and that's one of the most surprising elements of the book. And I wonder if you could just tell the audience a little bit about that. Shereen starts off citing something called the Encyclopedia of Pleasures, which was written in the 10th century, and honestly, Cosmopolitan would blush to publish it now. It includes things like
Shall I read? Shall I read? Okay,
do read a little bit.
Okay, so there is this long history of Arabic erotica. And what's very interesting now is that today the West looks at the Arab world and sees it as incredibly buttoned up and intolerant when it comes to sex. But it's very interesting that over centuries, if we go back a millennium, the criticism of Arab culture and Islamic culture was that it was too sexed up, basically. And that even the Prophet Muhammad, for example, used to talk extensively about sex. How can this man really claim to be a messenger of God if he is so obsessed with the pleasures of the flesh? And this tradition of Arabic writing continued for centuries. Can I ask a question? How many of you here have read 1001 Nights? Okay. How many of you have read the unexpurgated version with all the full frontal bits? Ah, okay. Well, this is just the tip of the iceberg, if you like, in terms of this literature. So one of these books from the 10th century, written by a man called Ali ibn Nasr al-Khatib, who was based in Baghdad, these books are very hard to find in Arabic now. It's much easier to find them in translation in English or indeed in French. And so this is a book I read in translation at one London library, and this is one of the many passages that caught my eye. And it talks about a woman in the early years of Islam. She's called Hubba al-Madaniyah. Hubba al-Madaniyah, for instance, said that one day she went out of the bath accompanied by a boy who had a puppy. It so happened that the puppy, seeing her vulva and vaginal lips, went between her legs and began to lick her organ. She lowered her body to give the animal a better chance of performing its job. However, when she had reached an orgasm, she fell down heavily upon it and could not raise herself until the helpless animal had died from heavy pressure. Apologies to animal lovers in the audience. The dirty looks I received from fellow readers in this London library as I quite literally chortled my way through these books. And the reason I return to this heritage in the book is not to say that the past is some sort of sexual paradise. I am not a sexual Salafi. I'm not suggesting we go back to the 10th century or the time of the Prophet. What I am saying, however, is that today's closed-mindedness and our discomfort with sex is not always as we have been as Arabs and as Muslims. And in particular, this message is very important because young people who stand up and want to ask questions, why do we have the taboos we have today, are often confronted by religious conservatives who say, no, you can't talk about this. It is against our traditional values as Arabs and Muslims. And my message in the book is no. When Arabs were at the height of their civilization, their political, economic, and social power, at least as this writing reflects, they were at ease in their sexual skin, and that is not a coincidence.
Shereen, you were saying that, in fact, it's been only in your father's lifetime that these sexual norms have shifted so dramatically.
Certainly, the discourse around sex has closed down. The public discussion around sex has closed down quite dramatically over the last 30, 40 years. And this is, in my opinion, a function of the rise of Islamic conservatism in Egypt and many parts of the Arab region, and very narrow readings of Islam in all domains, politics and economics and social issues, but in particular around women and sexuality. And yes, it's quite remarkable the speed with which this closure has occurred, and that now the only context for public discussion in media, for example, around sex is sex as a tragedy or a scandal or a catastrophe, as opposed to the long history of talking about sex as a source of pleasure and well-being and empowerment.
And why did it shift so dramatically?
It's a very interesting question, and it's one that a number of historians have looked at, and I quote them in the book. Essentially, this winding down on sex and the drawing up of the literature, you see it in the 19th century, and it's not a coincidence that this is the beginning of European colonization of many countries in the Arab region. And many historians have argued that essentially what happened is that Arabs began to see themselves through Western eyes. And the Western perspective on Arab sexual culture of the time was one that is debauched. For example, if you read Victorian writers on Arab society, they're obsessed with homosexuality and the debauched sodomy of the Arabs. Now, fast forward to today, and the perspective is reversed, and many Arabs will complain about the debauched life of the West. So it's the beginning of a European influence, and then again, in the 20th century, and most recently with the rise of Islamic conservatism, which is in itself the product of a almost perfect storm of historical, political, economic circumstances, which have come to basically close down on all domains, including sex. And the interesting question moving forward is that if sex is a reflection of this closure, what if we turn that on its head? What if we say that we have the possibility of moving into a new phase of history in the Arab region, opening up on a number of areas? Will sex be part of that?
One of the fascinating things that you talk about in the book is the very powerful effect that labour migration of Egyptian men to Saudi Arabia has had on sexual and behavioural norms in Egypt. And Shereen explains in the book that it's been a double whammy, that the men who've been away first come back demanding that their women dress and behave much more conservatively, so that women who were rarely veiled in Shereen's childhood, now 90% of women in Egypt are veiled, and that's principally an importation of the norms from Saudi. But at the same time, the men who've been away have also been exposed to prostitutes and porn.
Well, you can get that in Egypt as well. You don't have to travel.
But you imply that because they're away, they get a lot more of it, and they're coming back demanding more sexual adventurousness from their wives, and then being bitter when they don't get it.
But again, in my experience, the men are quite conflicted around sex. Now, I need to point out that we don't have a robust empirical base to talk about sexual life in the Arab region. We don't have a Kinsey report. We don't have a Haidt report. And one of the things I am hoping in the years to come with a growing climate of freedom of expression and intellectual freedom, that we will start to see this sort of research. But insofar as my own anecdotes and my own research shows, there is a problem at the heart of marriage when it comes to sex. And the Citadel that I talk about in my title is really referring to the fact that there is only now one socially accepted context for sexual life in the Arab world, and that's marriage. And it's not any old marriage. It has to be approved by your family, it has to be religiously permissible, and it has to be registered by the state. And the problem is that increasing numbers of people in the Arab world don't fit in the Citadel. If you're not in the Citadel, you're not supposed to be having sex. What are you going to do? The problem is inside the Citadel as well. And certainly I found that wives, for example, are deeply frustrated. The longing that they express to me of greater satisfaction they wanted in all aspects of their marriage, including the bedroom. So if I can just tell you one anecdote. So many wives are telling me about, frankly, how useless their husbands were in bed. And it's not just me. We have sexologists now across the Arab region. Some of them have TV shows. They talk about sex within the context of Islam. And they get lots of couples coming with sexual dysfunction. And so, of course, this idea of the Arab man being useless in bed is contrary to the whole school of the desert romance. So I bought some of these books and I gave them to friends in the Arab region, asked them to have a read and tell me, what do you think?
Is this Mills and Boon?
Absolutely, absolute Harlequin romance. I am now on their favored readers list to be sure I get all the latest titles now. And even 50 Shades of Grey I also gave to a number of people. Whether we'll ever see 50 Shades of Sand, that's another story. In any case, my friends laughed their heads off. They said, where do Westerners get this idea about the Arab lover? And as one of them said to me, his magnificently honed body, have these people never been to the Gulf? The men, they're all overweight. The only exercise they do is race their 4x4s on the highway. And when it talked about the Arab lover's ability to give his partner pleasure until she could be pleasured no more, then and only then he would take his release, one of my friends turned to me and said, Let me tell you, Shereen, it's 5 minutes only. It's his pleasure. No kissing, no foreplay. He falls asleep, then he gets up and watches television. Now, the problem for these women, though, is that they wanted to be able to express themselves in the bedroom. They wanted more, and yet they felt conflicted because they thought that if they showed some spark, they would be seen as bad women. And indeed, I tell the story in the book of a young woman who went on the internet before her wedding night, wanted to make the most of this big break. Because remember, I mean, getting married is your ticket to having sanctioned sex. Her husband was so horrified when she initiated activity that he hauled her out of bed and made her swear on a Quran that she had not had experience before marriage. So that's on the women's side. On the men's side, as you say, there is a lot of porn going down, if I can use that term, across the Arab region. And men certainly want to have more exciting sex lives. And yet, when their wives show this initiative, they feel conflicted about that. And this actually speaks to a much deeper problem in gender relations in the Arab region. Because in many cases, women are now educated, increasingly educated. They are connected to the wider world through internet and satellite television. And yet they feel that the men have not moved on as they had. And in fact, one young woman in Tunisia, when I talked to her about changing sexual attitudes and changing attitudes in general towards gender relations, she said, yes, women, we are more educated, but the man, he is still prehistoric. And that speaks to so much in and outside the bedroom as well.
Is there any way that that would change? What would force it to? Since men still have so much of the economic power and the power over women legally.
Absolutely, and the patriarchy runs deep in Arab society. Just because we got rid of the father of the nation, in terms of Mubarak or Ben Ali, does not mean that the father of the family still doesn't call the shots. And these patriarchal attitudes are not just held by men, they're also espoused by many women as well. Changing that, I think, is going to require a raft of modifications, both in the public sphere and also in personal life. I mean, certainly legal reform is going to be key. Laws across the Arab region are deeply discriminatory towards women, although the constitutions have plenty of fine words about the equality of men and women. The reality in law, whether it's on the books or in practice, is that it's unfair towards women. And that needs to change. But changing the law is not enough in the Arab region. If I can give you one example, in Egypt, for example, we have a law which criminalizes female genital mutilation. It was passed in 2008. And yet, today...
Before you say any more, can I just ask this room, what percentage...
Very good question.
Well, you asked them. What percentage of women would you assume in Egypt had
been circumcised?
Had been circumcised. I can just tell you the starting point that I, thinking it was a kind of liberal country, thought, probably 30. Yeah?
Yeah,
90, you're incredibly well informed. Much better informed than I was.
So if we look at one of the most recent surveys of Egyptian youth in 2009, 80% of 15 to 17-year-old girls have been circumcised. And again, the reason I bring up the limitations of the law is that the law doesn't make a blind bit of difference in Egypt. Women keep on cutting, in part because they use it as a tool of resistance, because they see that the law was passed by the Mubarak regime and that was unrepresentative of the people and it was in hock to the West, and this is how they assert themselves. So law can have perverse consequences in the Arab region, and legal reform needs to be tackled very, very carefully. I would say the absolute key to change is education. And it's not just education in schools. In many parts of the Arab region, for example, we now have more women than men in university. The problem really is education in the home. And how do you raise boys and girls to treat one another? Typically, in an Egyptian household, a girl will be raised to serve her brothers, that she will have to obey her brothers, that she will have to do the chores and her brothers get off scot-free, that her brothers can go out and she must stay at home. A classic illustration of this, that the brothers can go out and ride bicycles, for example. Even in Saudi Arabia now, women can ride bicycles. That's just been approved, although as one commentator remarked, all they get to really do is just ride them in a circle. But that aside, but very often in Egyptian households, girls are protected in part because they're seen as more fragile. But the key issue here is about their virginity. So there is a fear that if she rides a bicycle, for example, or if she uses a water hose to wash herself after using the bathroom, ablutions are part of Islam, or indeed if she uses a tampon, that her hymen will break and this will be a catastrophe. And so girls are held to different standards of behavior than boys, and that needs to change for anything really to change moving forward. And a number of the women I talk about in the book, one woman in particular who runs a club for divorced women in Egypt, a Facebook site and a radio station, because divorce is still highly stigmatizing for women. And it was very interesting when I asked her, how are you going to achieve a better image or more acceptance for divorced women in society? She said, I am starting with my son. How he treats women and how he sees marriage, that will be key to marriages moving forward.
Yes, what makes you think that anyone will want to change the way they bring up their boys and their girls? I mean, if you are parents and you're accustomed to this power relationship and the man's in charge, why is he going to start telling his sons to behave differently?
But I think we are starting to see.
You think that's happening?
To see change. I mean, definitely on certain aspects of sexual rights, for example, we are seeing change. If you look at what's been happening around sexual violence, for example, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago when I started writing this book, sexual harassment was a fact of life in Egypt and many parts of the Arab region, and yet women never spoke out. They would never go to authorities, they wouldn't want to tell their family, and certainly they would really keep it under wraps and just live with it. Now that has changed completely, in part because of a response to tragedy. In Egypt, we have had now these spectacular cases of sexual violence against women, and yet they are speaking out. And it's not just women who are speaking out, it's young men standing alongside these women and saying this is not acceptable. And so I do think we are starting to see some change. Now, these are more on negative sexual rights, so freedom from coercion, freedom from violence, freedom from discrimination. The real challenge is going to be making movement on positive sexual rights, such as, for example, the freedom to express your sexuality openly. And if I can just give one example for that, because it's a really fascinating illustration of the limits of change. So, how many of you are familiar with Femen? Okay. So you may know that Femen has gained some ground in the Arab region.
You should just explain it.
Okay. So Femen is a group of mainly young women. It's an organization which came out of the Ukraine. And one of the ways that they protest against oppression of women is by baring their breasts and writing slogans on them. And most recently, they've been protesting in front of embassies of Arab countries in a number of European capitals.
I'm not sure that lots of them who look at it see it as a protest so much as just a free show.
Yes, again, depending on your perspective. One of the earliest feminine-like episodes we had in the Arab region was a woman called Alia Al-Mahdi, and she's known as the nude photo revolutionary. So in about 2011, Alia Al-Mahdi posted nude pictures of herself on her blog. Now I have to say they were more Victorian postcard than Victoria's Secret. Nonetheless, they were hugely popular, more than 1 million hits within 24 hours. And what's very interesting is that there were some women, young women, who congratulated her and said, yes, this is right, this is your freedom of expression in the new order, and this is your attempt to exert some control over your own body, what you do with your own body. And remember, women in particular, because of virginity and all the taboos around sex, they're subjected to collective control of their own bodies, and particularly their virginity. So not only, though, did religious conservatives come out against Alia Al-Mahdi, but what was most interesting is that the main youth political movements that have been in the vanguard of the uprising of 2011 also came out against her. And they said, this is not the revolution we are looking for. We are a Muslim country. We are an Arab country. We don't want this sort of freedom. You are discrediting the revolution. So you're right. It's going to take a considerable amount of effort to have people work on positive sexual rights, and also to realize that the connection between what's happening in the bedroom and what's happening outside the bedroom. If you don't anchor justice and freedom and equality and dignity and privacy in your sexual and personal life, I believe it's going to be very difficult to achieve that in public life and in political life.
One of the points that you make in the book is that one of the powerful factors driving sexual frustration now is the fact that premarital and extramarital sex is absolutely taboo, and yet the age of marriage is rising. It's now 3 years older than people certainly in Egypt consider to be desirable, and that's because marriage has become so extraordinarily expensive for men that they can't afford to take on wives. So the period in which people are sexually aware but unable to be legitimately sexually active is getting longer and longer. And I was just wondering, since the Arab Spring and the chaos of the Egyptian economy, presumably that kind of problem has only got worse. What do you think is going to happen about that, and what ways are people finding of getting around those prohibitions?
Well, certainly many young people in Egypt, for example, are turning to what are known as Orphe marriages, so customary marriages. So these are marriages which are not registered with the state, and yet, depending upon whom you ask, may or may not be Islamically acceptable, whether they check all the boxes. There is actually some debate about what constitutes a marriage, what are the conditions for marriage in Islam.
But they take place in front of witnesses?
Yes.
And with contracts?
There can be verbal contracts. These informal marriages are used for a variety of purposes. In some cases, in fact, let me give you one concrete example of a woman I discuss in the book. She's called Amani. She comes from the south of Egypt, very conservative part of the country. Amani is in her late 20s. She met a young man through a friend. This is often how marriages occur now in Egypt. There is a sort of connection. You meet someone through someone. He came with his family to meet her family. Marriage is not about two individuals getting together. It's about families getting together. And her parents said, no, you can't marry him. And one of the reasons they said no is that Amani, unusually for Egyptian women, only about 25% of Egyptian women work outside the home in any formal employment. She had a well-paying job, and her parents didn't want her to marry because they were afraid that that income would flow to the new couple. Okay. They pleaded, they cajoled, and finally they gave up. And Amani said that I'm going to act on my heart's desire. She went with her fiancé to Cairo, and they had one of these informal marriages in a lawyer's office. Yes, there were witnesses, but she didn't have the approval of her father, which some people would say is a requirement of marriage in Islam, but other people would argue, no, look, this woman is in her late 20s, she's been to university, she knows what she's doing. What Amani was trying to do, and she told me, look, I cannot have sex outside of marriage. I believe that is haram. So what she's trying to do with this construct of Orphe marriage is to satisfy the needs of the flesh and also salve her conscience. And the problem for her is that she felt deeply conflicted. She felt that she had betrayed her parents' trust. She was angry at her family at forcing her into this position. And then she was now having doubts as to whether this was really Islamically permissible or not. And so these informal marriages for young people, this is them trying to deal with the constraints around the cost of marriage, are not seen as an alternative lifestyle choice. They are a last resort. The vast majority of people in the Arab world want to get inside the Citadel. They want to be married. They don't necessarily want to pull it down.
And in Amani's case, she couldn't tell her parents about this marriage, could she? It was just a private arrangement.
Exactly. And one of her concerns was about the question of honor crime. That there was a story in her family that the sister of her grandmother had a relationship before marriage and that she had been killed. Now, honor crimes are a shadowy subject in the Arab region, and no one knows the full extent. But this was alive and well in Amani's family. But more interestingly than that was her concern that if this informal marriage ever became known, that it would damage not her reputation, as she told me, but my family's reputation and her father's reputation. And that is one of the key constraints to realizing sexual rights in the Arab region, that in the region we are not really operating as individuals. The state, for example, doesn't really recognize or respect our rights as individual agents the only protection we have, whether it's economic because we can't get jobs and therefore are dependent on our families, or legal protection, if I get into trouble in Egypt, the best I can hope for is a call to my uncle and hope that he can use his influence to get me out of trouble. I can't rely on the state to recognize or respect my rights as an individual. And until that changes, it's going to be very, very hard to realize sexual rights.
You have an extraordinary statistic about how many people live with their parents and how many couples still live with their parents in explaining just how deep this dependency goes. In a country without a welfare state, your family is what you depend upon, and you can't afford to alienate them or their values. What were those statistics, Shereen? I think was it 40% of married couples live with their in-laws?
Yes.
And 90% of unmarried women, is that right?
It's very hard, yeah, the 90% plus. It's very hard to move out of your family's home, all the more so if you're a young woman. I myself, for example, before I married, when I started this book, I was single, and I found it very difficult to have people rent a place to me in many parts of the Arab region, because the question is, well, if you are a good woman from a good family, what are you doing living on your own? The challenge, of course, is that, remember what I talked about, the prehistoric men from the women's perspective. The difficulty we now have is that one of those groups that are outside the Citadel are intelligent, dynamic, educated, successful, professionally successful women who can't find a husband. And what are they going to do? Many of them I know live at home with their parents. It's very hard to have a private life, and you're definitely not supposed to be having a sexual life. And also remember, there is a real drive and a desire to have children in the Arab region. When you get married in Egypt, you are expected to produce a child by your first wedding anniversary. And if you don't, I can tell you it is a catastrophe. It is a family tragedy, and I speak about this from personal experience. So, and what's interesting actually is contraceptive use. So we know a lot about contraception in the Arab region. Contraception is not actually, it's not against Islam. Family planning is permitted. And yet virtually no couple uses contraception in the first year of marriage. And I know young brides who are going on fertility treatment within 6 months of marriage because they haven't conceived yet. You must remember that the definition of primary fertility for treatment is the failure to conceive after a year of productive intercourse. Now, I have to tell you, given the lack of sexuality education, how little young people know, I really wonder how productive that intercourse is in the first place. And yet the pressure is to have kids, and so these young women in particular are turning to artificial assistance to get things going. So again, what are you going to do? You can't get married, you can't have kids. How are you going to realize what is a fundamental human right? And you don't at the moment. And that is going to be one of the challenges in the years to come. The flip side of that, and I talk about this in the book, is what do you do if you've had sex outside of marriage and you actually have a child? The phenomenon of unwed motherhood. We have orphanages heaving with kids in Egypt, for example. And when I talked to the director of one of these orphanages and I danced around the subject and I said, maybe it's because poverty, families can't afford to keep their children. And she said, no, it's because people are having sex outside of marriage and they don't want to keep the child. And so one of the interesting groups I talk about in the book, in Morocco, there's these incredibly brave and creative NGOs that are trying to find a space for unwed mothers, and it's not easy. So it's not that things can't change. Things do change in the Arab region. They just change slowly. They change on a small scale. It's hard to scale up. And very often the change doesn't look like the change we saw in the West. It's a different approach.
And presumably much more hidden. I'd be interested to know whether the women that you talk to, particularly after being introduced to vibrators and so on, whether their sex lives changed. I mean, did any of them dare to take any initiative, or does that remain hidden? Because you also talk in the book, and there's a marvellous scene where Shereen describes going into lingerie shops and seeing some really rather remarkable things like bras that play, I can't remember, Mary Has a Little Lamb when you prod them.
Old MacDonald has a farm.
Old MacDonald has a farm there, much the same thing. And raunchy knickers with plastic scorpions on the front. Why anyone would want those, I don't know, but apparently they sell well. And discovering that a lot of the clientele are very conservative, veiled women who feel that they have to buy this kind of stuff because they're always concerned about whether they're going to lose their men. And they have to seduce them whether they're conservative or not. So how much evidence did you get of anything improving or changing in the bedroom?
You see, Jenny, I would formulate that differently, and I would say that this lingerie is actually a tool of empowerment. These women see this not as a form of oppression. They actually see it as a tool of empowerment, because although they cannot say, Habibi, I want to have sex tonight, that would be considered shameful, they can put on an alluring piece, or lurid, if you like, piece of lingerie, and signal their desire that way. And it's really important in looking at sexual culture in the Arab region to realize that women are not helpless and they are not hopeless. They are finding ways, as they have throughout history, to have their own way. And they are subverting the controls. They are highly creative in that way. And that's one of the key messages of the book. It will take a long time for things to change. I'm often asked, do you expect to see a sexual revolution in the Arab region? And my answer to that is, well, we haven't even seen a political revolution, quite frankly. We have new faces in power trying to run countries as business as usual without the tools of enforcement of the old regimes. So if we're not seeing this dramatic break with the past in politics, we're certainly not going to see it in sex, because it involves so many other dimensions. But I would say that a number of aspects of sexual life are slowly changing. And as I said, it's in certain pockets, in certain parts of the region, but people are not sitting still. And the challenge will be, can we talk more openly about these alternative views? And can we embolden people to really start tackling the taboos? And I think yes. I think that they are now challenging, for example, political taboos that we were taught never to touch in the Arab region, one of these red lines. They are starting to ask questions about Islam and the role of Islam in society that we simply didn't talk about 10 years from now. Things move. They just move slowly, and as I've said, often in a different direction than in the West.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to throw the questions open to the floor now. If you'd like to say who you are, that would be of interest to the rest of us.
Sorry, is that on? Yeah. Hi. I was just wondering if you look at all at the temporary marriages that happen quite a lot in, I think, sort of Shia areas of the Middle East.
Do you want to take a couple?
Should we take 3 at a time, and then we'll, lady at the back, and wherever you get the microphone, Millicent. I'm leaving it around you. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I had a question about the process you went through doing the research. Given that it's such a taboo topic, what kind of antagonism did you face from society, maybe from the state, or attention you got that was an obstacle to your research? And then, given that you were there during such a crucial period before the revolution to after, how those attitudes might have changed towards your research?
Thanks. Lady at the back.
Hi. I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the HIV and some of the feelings that were expressed towards that, how families coped if it was denied, if they were able to get treatment, and how they, if they admitted that it was related to sex, all of those sorts of areas.
Thank you. Shereen, the summer marriages. I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's one of the best bits of the book.
Actually, the woman there was actually speaking about a very specific type of marriage.
Is that a different thing,
Yeah,
a temporary marriage?
Yeah, so temporary marriage is what is known as zawaj muta. So these are pleasure marriages. They're a particular construct in Shia Islam. Essentially, this means that a man and a woman can come together for essentially a sexual relationship under the cover of an Islamically permissible marriage. It's for a very specific period of time. There are certain conditions. Any children born of the marriage, if paternity is recognized, do have rights of inheritance. But women, for example, walk away with the money that they were given by their temporary husbands. They don't have rights of inheritance. This is something, mota or sire, which is, as it's known in Iran, it's common there. It's known in Shia parts of the Arab region, so where you find Shia Muslims in Bahrain, in Lebanon, and in Iraq, for example. It raises a really interesting question because although these marriages are Islamically permissible, they're not socially acceptable. And any woman with a reputation to maintain who's Shia would probably not put this on her CV. And it's a very interesting question why, and it really comes to a broader issue of social acceptability and how we often dress up social convention in religion. So we have an analogous structure in Sunni Islam, these Orphe marriages. We have other structures called misyar marriages. We have all sorts of informal marriages. And very often people will say, in criticizing, they are un-Islamic. But they do tick the boxes. The problem is that they circumvent family control. So when two young people come together in one of these informal marriages, people say, it is haram. Well, is it really? Depends on whom you ask in terms of the religious permissibility, but what we do know is that it is circumventing family control. It is two young people making a decision about how they want to lead their lives, and that's what's at the heart of the objections. And so it is a very interesting phenomenon. It is growing, certainly in many parts of the region. We can come back to the summer marriage trade because that's a different type of marriages, a bewildering array of marriage structures in Islam, which actually speaks to the flexibility of Islam around sex. It recognizes the power of sex. It tries to channel it into structures that will reduce confusion and disorder in society. But those structures themselves can be much more flexible than we as Muslims today are willing to acknowledge. On the question of the process of research, and this is actually related to the other question of HIV. When I sat down to talk to men and women from all walks of life about sex, I had the advantage of my work on HIV. It is much easier to get in the door wearing the white coat of public health than it is if I sat down and said, hey, I want to talk about sexual rights, or heaven forfend, I want to talk about gay rights. And because there is an interest in public health, it does make it easier. If I can just cite one example, in the context of HIV, over the course of a couple of years, I was part of a series of workshops that were run between religious leaders, Shia, Sunni, and Christian from across the Arab region, and men who have sex with men. And this was done under the umbrella of HIV, because there is an emphasis in Islam and Christianity to reduce harm to the community, for example. We're supposed to protect our societies. And so without the cover of HIV, we could not have come together. These religious leaders could not have sat down with these men who have sex with men. And it was incredibly valuable because we found that the religious leaders had all the prejudices about homosexuality as the rest of the society. They thought that they were pedophiles, they thought that they were rapists, they thought they were debauched and self-indulgent. After about 4 years, what we found is that attitudes had changed completely and that they really understood the difficulties that these men face. And as one of them said to me, I had no idea these men were suffering in the way they do. I cannot tell them that what they do is halal, that it is permitted. But I, as a Muslim leader, want to find a way that they can live in our society. They are our brothers. So public health really has proved enormously advantageous. Using a public health lens is very limiting, though, because it only lets you look at some aspects of sex and not others. But at least it gets you in the door. So far, no fatwas against the book, although I'm told that they do wonders for sales. Not that I'm actually asking for them. But so far, the book has, at least in English, has been well received in Muslim communities around the world from the feedback I'm receiving. Whether attitudes changed or not, again, I don't think we're going to see a dramatic break. We are certainly seeing more openness about talking about some issues. What I found very interesting is that many of the people I interviewed at the start of my book did not want me to use their names. And I went back after the uprisings, as I was finishing the book, and asked everyone if I could use their names. And basically everyone said yes. So there was an opening, and in fact, for some people, I actually counsel them not to use their names because things have changed, but not that much, and there are dangers, particularly for more marginalized groups like men who have sex with men, or indeed female sex workers, who are by far the most marginalized group of all the communities I talk about in the book. I have a whole chapter on female sex work. Ironically, it is the most visible face of sex in the Arab region. How many people have been to a major capital in the Arab world? Okay, if you stayed at any international hotel, you will know that sex work is alive and well in the Arab region. But the problem for these women is that they are highly stigmatized, and so although they're visible, they're also invisible at the same time. On the subject of HIV, there are only 2 parts of the world now which have rising numbers of HIV infections and deaths from AIDS, and the Middle East and North Africa is one of them. We are coming on to the curve of HIV. Although we have very low rates of HIV in the generalized population, we have what are called concentrated epidemics. So groups that are at most risk of contracting HIV, injecting drug users, female sex workers, men who have sex with men, they have infection rates in many countries of 5, 10, 15, 20%. That is alarming. The problem that we have is that HIV is still highly stigmatized. It's seen as a disease which comes from illicit activity. It's hard to get these vulnerable groups to get tested for HIV. Who's going to turn up to a government clinic to be tested for HIV if it also happens to be an illegal behavior, and you could end up in prison? Condom use, for example, is negligible in many parts of the Arab world. Arab men, like men the world over, don't like using condoms, but there is an additional complexity in the Arab region in that family planning within marriage, the Citadel, is usually a woman's responsibility, so they're all female methods. If you're using a condom, you must be having sex outside of marriage, and therefore that is haram. And so there is a deterrent, a psychological deterrent to using condoms. The consequence of this is that HIV spreads. No population is an island. Men who have sex with men also have sex with women in the Arab region. And this is how it spreads. For those who are interested in this subject, there was a great film that was made a year ago. It's called Asma, and it's about a woman who became HIV positive, and it shows really the depths of discrimination and stigma that in particular women face around HIV. And one of the great tragedies in the Arab region is that only around 15% of people who need to be on antiretroviral treatment for HIV are actually getting the drugs they need. So it's a mess, basically. And although some progress has been made around HIV, we have a very, very long way to go. And the tragedy for us in the Arab region is that there are plenty of other parts of the world, in Southern Africa, in India, that said, we will never have HIV. Our culture, our traditions protect us. And look where they are today. We are the one part of the world where we could stop HIV in its tracks if we faced up to the reality of sexual life in our region.
Thank you. Some more questions, please. Could you take the mic down the centre a bit? Thank you.
Hi. When people talk about the Arab region and the culture of sex,
So you're a bit quiet.
when you talk about the Arab region and the culture of sex, the word Arab and Islam is intertwined as one, and yet the Arab region isn't limited to the religion of Islam. So how different is the culture of sex in the Islamic world to the culture of sex in the Christian or Jewish world within the Middle East?
That's a huge question. Thank you.
Thank you for the subject of my next book.
Was a gentleman just in front, so I'll take 3 again, and then somebody with their hand up with a pencil. Sorry, go ahead.
I rather fear this is also probably a very large question, but the progress of Western sexual revolution and the empowerment of women has been sort of long and tortuous. And if you go back to Jane Austen, the primacy of the family sort of rings parallels. But what do you think are the parallels and the future parallels, and what do you think are the fundamental real differences between the Arab experience of sex and a Western experience of sex and its revolution.
Thank you. And the lady in the middle.
I'll stand up so you can see me.
Okay.
This is about scarves. When you speak to a lot of women who wear scarves from Middle East and to men as well, they often explain that this is because they don't want to be a sexual object, and they sort of imply that if they did not wear the scarf, men would simply not be able to help themselves and sort of really attack them or proposition them. And I wondered if you spoke to anyone about that kind of attitude and that kind of way of looking at it.
Thank you. 3 fabulous questions. We've got 3 days. Yes, carry on.
Okay, let's begin with let's do this in reverse order. On the subject of scarves, I think you must be referring to headscarves, the hijab. It's very interesting if one looks specifically at Egypt and the phenomenon of sexual harassment. About 50% or more of young women experience sexual harassment on a daily basis in urban centers in Egypt. And some very interesting studies have been done asking women, actually showing them pictures of how were you dressed when you were harassed. And it shows a woman in a headscarf, and it shows a woman with free-flowing hair, and it shows a woman in niqab. And basically it's all the same. So as I said in an earlier version of the book, this fell out in editing, if you speared 2 watermelons with a mop and put an abaya, a cloak on it, and took it down the streets of Cairo, it would probably be sexually harassed. It's the hair and the the curves, frankly. I've talked to many women in Egypt in particular about the hijab. And in my own family, for example, some of the women cover, some of the women do not. My family is in a privileged position. They are educated. They have a certain wealth. These women are able to make a free and informed choice about whether to cover or not. And the reasons that they cover are as varied as the women themselves. Some do it out of modesty. They believe that this is their Islamic duty. This is how they define it. That in itself is debatable. What is really necessary to cover? What is the awra? The bits of the body that need to be covered in Islam. I have to tell you, however, that anyone who's been to Cairo recently will know that women have very subtle ways of subverting the scarf. So some young women I know will put on the headscarf because it cuts them some slack with their parents. It lets them out of the house. They're seen as being good girls. And yet, accompanying this headscarf are very tight jeans, very high heels, inches of makeup, big wraparound Gucci glasses, and in particular, these long spandex or lycra tunics, lycra being God's gift to Arab men, because it technically covers up all what they would define as the improper bits of the body that need to be covered and yet shows everything at the same time. So again, young women find ways of subverting this convention. I think what is very interesting, it is an interesting question moving forward, is that the putting on of the headscarf has been a barometer, if you like, of the rise of Islamic conservatism. And I wonder moving forward, given all the pushback we are now seeing against the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and the more conservative Salafi Muslims, whether we will actually see an unveiling trend, whether women will start to take off the scarf, questioning why they put it on in the first place. And that's something to watch in the years to come. I'm going to go now to the question of Arab and Islam, and I do point this out in the book. I am talking mainly about Sunni Islam, the dominant faith of the region and conventions therein, because it also dictates law in many countries, and in particular in Egypt, the focus of the book. Christian communities across the Arab region have many of the same constraints and taboos and restrictions around sex. One measure of this is female genital mutilation, which until quite recently has been very common. You found equal rates amongst Christian and Muslim families in Egypt. They're living side by side. They're subjected to the same cultural desire drivers to control female sexuality. What's interesting in the case of Christianity, the Coptic populations in Egypt, for example, is that actually rates of FGM have declined in those populations. And one of the reasons for that is that the Coptic Church has a centralized structure where a message comes down from the Pope and then it goes to priests. And so the message has come down that FGM, female genital mutilation, is unacceptable and it is not, has no valid basis in doctrine. In Sunni Islam, we don't have those organized structures. So we have free range imams that basically are saying what they want, often on the basis of very faulty information and poor understanding of the rudiments of Islam. And they are just talking about this in the local mosque. And so that accounts for some of the differences. But in my experience, I did not see huge distinctions in sexual attitudes and behaviors between Christian and Muslim populations. Virginity, for example, remains extremely important, irrespective of whether one is Muslim or Christian, and I'm talking about female virginity. Finally, the point, and the really excellent point you make about Jewish populations, my book is looking at the Arab region as opposed to the Middle East more broadly, so it did not really include a consideration of Israel. But it's certainly clear from research that Orthodox Jewish communities have all the same restrictions and hang-ups, quite frankly, that we see in conservative Muslim populations as well. And in fact, there is a very interesting scholarly literature about honeymoon impotence amongst Orthodox Jewish communities, and this comes from exactly the same driver as we see it in the Muslim populations, the lack of sexual education and the real drive of men not to want to perform on the wedding night and the pressures on them to do so. So tremendous similarities. And also, just one final point, on the incendiary topic of homosexuality, you find very similar attitudes in some Orthodox Jewish populations as you do in Muslim populations. And there's a whole separate question of what's called pinkwashing, which has to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and attitudes towards homosexuality. That's the subject of a different book and a new evening event, but very happy to talk about that in greater detail. Finally, the gentleman who asked the incredibly complex question, which really could have been the starting point for tonight's discussion. I think there is a tendency to look at the sexual climate of the Arab world today and to see these taboos around premarital sex and abortion and masturbation and homosexuality and the rest of it, and to say, okay, you are at the same point of departure in the Arab world as we were in the West in the 50s. Are you going to be heading in the same direction? And I think that things are going to move differently. Of course, the sexual revolution, as you pointed out, was not like a helicopter. It didn't take off from a land of taboo to a paradise of sexual freedom. It was more like one of those Hercules transport planes. One of those big lumbering things that need a huge runway, a very long runway to take off. And that runway was established over centuries of political, economic, and social reform. You know, arguably in the Arab world, I'm not sure that we even have the plane, and we definitely don't have the runway yet. And when we do have that, will we head in the same direction? I think one of the fundamental differences I talk in the book between Western sexual culture and Arab sexual culture is certainly this concept of confession, the ability to talk openly about sex. And Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher and who wrote extensively about the history of sexuality in the West, talked about how confession was central to sexual change in the West, and that we went from a culture of confession within a religious context to a culture of confession in a medical context, where in the 19th century people talked to psychiatrists and the like about sex, and now we are in a culture of media confession, basically, with YouTube and YouPorn and all that, and Oprah. What's different in Muslim culture is that we don't have a culture of confession. We actually have completely the reverse. We are enjoined as Muslims to conceal our sins. And if I can give you one very interesting example of that, there was a television show in Lebanon, which was tackling the red lines, the taboo subjects. And they had an episode on sex. This is, I think, in 2009. And in one of the segments in the show, they had a Saudi Arabian man who came on for 5 minutes and told us about his sex life. So he showed us his bedroom, and he had lotions and potions. I mean, this man actually used condoms, which, you know, from a public health standpoint, I want to stand up and applaud him, one of the very few men who does in the Arab region. And then he invited his friends over, and we saw them talking in very girlish terms about their sex life. And then he went out in his car and he showed how you Bluetooth young women to meet them on the streets. It was all very coy and very discreet. The next day, over 1,000 people turned up at the governor of Jeddah and demanded this man be punished. So it played out very...
Because he was explicitly having extramarital sex.
But what they were complaining about is not what he was doing. It's what he said he was doing, the fact that he made it public. Now, this cuts both ways. The primacy on privacy cuts both ways. If you're a young person or who's having sex, who's engaged in same-sex relations, one could argue, okay, privacy is actually useful because it's the one way we could find some accommodation in Islam. What you do in the privacy of your bedroom is your business. It is un-Islamic to spy on someone, and therefore, how would you ever get proof to bring a charge of sodomy against someone in that context? So privacy could be helpful. On the other hand, privacy means we don't talk about issues that we need to talk about now. And that is going to be the real challenge in
What happened
the years
in this
to come.
case?
So he was sentenced to, I think, 5 years in prison, 1,000 lashes. He lost his job at Saudi Arabian Airlines because during the segment, he talked about his fantasies, and one of them was joining the Mile High Club. Now, he was actually assigned to ground staff with Saudi Arabian Airlines, but he was seen as such a menace to the women, to the country's women folk, that he had to be removed. His sentence was eventually reduced.
To what?
Well, to less than 1,000 lashes, which is, you know, a good thing. And he was released,
But he was jailed.
for a time, I think. But again, the point here is that it was what he said he was doing rather than what he did. And it's really this is a big problem in the Arab region, this disjuncture between appearance and reality. In the end of the day, what people care about is not what you're doing, but it's what you're seen to be doing. And it can have really devastating consequences. If I can just give one example of that, when it comes to female virginity, which is defined as a piece of anatomy, not as a state of chastity. So, for example, in talking to young women about their sex lives, and this emphasis on maintaining an intact hymen is leading them, for example, to engage in anal sex without a condom, because they don't think they need to use a condom because they don't really know about HIV and there's no danger of getting pregnant. And yet, in the name of an intact hymen, the appearance of virginity, they're opening themselves to a wide variety of risks. And this disjuncture between appearance and reality is a problem in many, many aspects of Arab life, and it is something that we are going to have to deal with in the years to come.
You talked about I just wanted to mention this, the big business that's being done by plastic surgeons who are reconstructing hymens before marriage. Because
it's gynecologists who
gynecologists
do this, yeah.
And because you were explaining this, it's often in some communities still a matter of public show whether there's a blood-stained sheet at the time of marriage.
Yes, it's called dokhla, and it is an age-old practice, and it continues to this day. We have a saying in Egypt, the honor of a girl is like a match, it only lights once. And again, the importance of demonstrating virginity, because it's not just a woman's individual concern, it's about the honor of the family and the ability of the family and the men of the family to deliver an intact bride on the wedding night, which is, again, reinforcing practices like female genital mutilation to stop girls going off the rails. Again, women find ways of subverting this. So in poorer communities, you actually do find women who will agree quite readily to this practice of dokhla because it gives them more scope. They can go out of their communities. If they can get a job, they can work. And they are essentially trading off this, saying, right, you give me this freedom, and I will show you that I have been a good girl. So again, it's not just a tool of oppression. Some women can turn it to their favor. This
Gentleman at the front, and whoever hasn't asked a question yet, Lady at the front.
When the sexual revolution happened in the West, there wasn't the internet, and there is now.
I'm not sure we can hear you.
Sorry, when the sexual revolution happened in the West, there was no internet. Is
Closer.
it helpful or is it a hindrance?
Great question.
You speak in the book about there's a woman who's quoted talking about language, and she said that there's certain words that she would only ever say in English or in French to do with sex. She feels more comfortable speaking about them in a language that isn't her mother tongue. I just wonder if you could speak a bit about that and the effects of that. And another question, which is just a yes or no question, is the book available in Arabic?
There are never any yes or
Hang
no
on,
questions when it comes to sex in the Arab
One
world.
more. Sorry. Yes.
Hi, you've talked a lot about male homosexuality. I've seen you talking about that. Because the women were also very open with you, I was wondering what was said about female sex relations, if some of them were experimenting with girls before marriage, partly to get around some of the hymen stuff as well, and what some of the women might have said about fantasies that they might have had with other women, and if that's talked about at all in the Arab world. And also in terms of porn, if there's a lot of porn that's focused on that sort of lesbian fantasy as well, and if men are talking about that at all.
Okay. So on the question of the internet, as anywhere in the world, it is both a benefit, but it's also a bane. It depends. Certainly, for many young people, it is a source of valuable information. And this is particularly true of young men and women who have sex with their own sex. So, for example, there are a number of websites now in Arabic which have online magazines, for example, which are talking about homosexuality or transgender, transsexuality with information and support. It's quite useful. Certainly, given the lack of sexuality education in schools, the internet can be a very powerful tool of information for the general population. And there are a number of innovative projects in the region which are trying to get information across via the internet. But as I said, as with anywhere, the internet can also cause problems, and certainly I would say the balance of information on the internet about sex is often from an Islamic perspective in Arabic, and some of it can be very confusing for young people. On the topic of masturbation, for example, you are more likely to find a website that is preaching fire and brimstone and is telling you that you were going to go to hell, and before you get there, you're going to be blind and deformed and impotent. So it's deeply problematic, and of course we have censorship of the internet as well in many countries. So it's hard to get information around sex. Just on the subject of pornography, it has a very interesting consequences. One of the women I went to see, a hairdresser, also specializes in doing a type of magic, which is very popular in the Arab region, to get sort of special spells to keep your husband faithful, for example. She said that one of the reasons that she had so many women coming to her is that men were watching so much porn and were expecting to have a more exciting sex life, and then were slightly horrified, though, when their wives were stepping up to the plate. Again, this is part of the conflict. One incredibly interesting story I came across to do with pornography has to do with female genital mutilation. Now, whether girls are cut or not cut has very little to do with the men of the family. It's one of these strange sort of lacunae where men tend to call the shots in so many domains, and yet in this they don't. And it's women who are making the decision. And yet, it was very interesting that male attitudes were being shaped by pornography, because they know that women in the West are not circumcised. And so they were saying, well, you see, these movies show that we had better circumcise our girls, because look, these uncircumcised women, they're having sex with 2, 3 men at the same time. We told you this would happen if we didn't cut our girls. So the internet has benefits and also severe disadvantages at the same time. On the subject of language, yes, it is very interesting, and it is a measure of how closed Arab thinking has become around sex, that the language that most people have to talk about sex in Arabic is the language of the street. and it is not fit really for public discourse, and it is not appropriate for certainly mixed conversations between men and women. And many women feel embarrassed to talk about sex because they don't have a language in which to do so. Now, if we go back 1,000 years, we used to have whole dictionaries of sex in Arabic. And in fact, there is one famous book which is imaginatively entitled The Language of Fucking, which includes over 1,000 verbs for to have sex. And now where are we today? One of the most interesting projects I came across in the Arab region was a group called Muntada Jinsanaya. This means the Arab form for sexuality. Oh, and just as an aside, we don't even have a word in Arabic for sexuality which is widely recognized. So that's really, Jinsanaya is a neologism. It's not widely recognized even by educated people. One of the most interesting aspects of this project, it's run by a fascinating Palestinian sex educator living in Israel, but one of the things that she insists is that in the training in schools or in workshops, that people speak about sex in Arabic, because many Palestinians living in Israel feel much more comfortable talking about sex in Hebrew than they do in Arabic. So reclaiming Arabic as a language of sexuality is important in that context, not just from a personal or sexual standpoint, but it also has political implications as well. And again, that's going to be very important across the board, I think, in the Arab region moving forward. Whether the book has been translated into Arabic, it's currently in discussion. It's not easy to find a publisher who's willing to take on this book in Arabic, in part because the region is, quite frankly, in an economic mess, and publishing industry is in turmoil as it is in many parts of the world. But also state censorship exists. And so this book is now pending in censorship departments in a number of Arab countries. It is now on sale in several countries, Lebanon and I gather in Egypt as well. But getting it through in Arabic will be a real test of my thesis, actually. I am suggesting in this book that we are entering into a new phase in which we will be able to challenge these taboos. Well, a real test of that is, can we get my book into the region in Arabic? Inshallah, we will see.
The question was, would the book be censored so that bits would be cut out, or will the whole thing go through in a lump, or not?
Again, I'm not certain of that. I haven't actually had interactions with the censors as yet. So whether we will see large strokes through the book in various key points. And of course, going back to the internet, the book can be downloaded on Kindle. So there are ways, again, of getting around these restrictions. On the question of female same-sex relations, yes, there's a whole section in my book on women who have sex with women. I'm using these terms very advisedly. I'm not. Some women self-identify as lesbian or queer, but many women do not. In talking to these women, I found that they were tremendously lonely in many ways, because men who have sex with men, although male sodomy is seen as haram, particularly if you're the passive partner. It's okay against Islam, most people will say, but if you're the active party, are you really homosexual? I mean, this is a long-standing attitude in the region. But they are men, and so they can go out. And although they are subjected to the full force of the law, people who get arrested for same-sex relations in many parts of the Arab world, they tend to be men. They had more freedom because they are men. They can go out, they can express their sexuality more easily. For women, it's much harder. And they have their movements circumscribed. And so the internet actually becomes very important for women who have sex with other women, because it's a chance for them to meet other women in a way that they can't just go out to a cafe and meet other women.
Are you talking about married women?
All of the above. Single women, married women. What I found interesting is that 1,000 years ago, there are these books of Arabic erotica which speak extensively of both male and female sexuality, homosexuality. And there's a real understanding, and in some of these books, one of which is, I quote here, there was a real understanding. There was a a celebration of it and a thought that it was actually superior to having relations with men. Why would you have sex with a man when you could have sex with a woman? If you move forward to today, there is an almost lack of understanding about female homosexuality. In a sense, there is an almost Clinton-like logic in the Arab world. If it doesn't involve a penis and penetration, is it really sex? What is also interesting, though, is that there are a number of support groups run by tiny groups of activists. The most notable one is in Lebanon. It's called MEME. And it's extremely interesting because how they go about trying to find a place for women who have sex with women is actually more relevant for all populations who cross the heterosexual line in the Arab region. And the way they try to subtly negotiate these difficulties because they are women has relevance in other parts of the world, not just for women, but also for men as well in some of the more repressive societies in the region.
Shereen, thank you very much. I think I sort of feel we should stop because everyone's getting sort of hot and tired. But I think you could answer some questions while you sign your book, don't you?
Absolutely, and please come forward after this as well. I'll be around for a while and would be delighted to talk further with you. Thank you very much for coming by.